Perfect. Theo, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Good. I thought this would be a really fun conversation to round things out. I think a lot of people kind of take a really direct angle into the mental health conversation, and I think your passion and your pursuit of running is a really interesting kind of way to follow in there.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I kind of always dabbled with running. I was always a surfer first and foremost, and was kind of ran as a means of like staying fit, but it was never a thing on its own. Until maybe like 2019, I started to get more serious about it. And then COVID happened, beaches started shutting down, and I kind of just ignored surfing for a while and was like, well, I can't, beaches are closed. I'm getting a ticket if I go to the beach, I might as well run. And so it kind of happened like on accident. Like the universe kind of just like decided, okay, you're not surfing for a while, you're running for a while. And so I spent like a year kind of doing that on my own, just trying to build a relationship with it. And then it was really like 2020, halfway through 2020, where I kind of got a little bit more serious about it.
You knew I'm going to stick with this.
Yeah, I was kind of like, oh wait, I actually haven't ever felt comfortable ignoring like my first love of surfing for this long, and like I wasn't even thinking about it, and I was like, I'm like really down the rabbit hole right now with running, and I was like enjoying the people I was meeting, I was enjoying the conversations I was having about it, and then just like physically was enjoying the act itself. And so it was really like 2020, I kind of got serious, and then that kind of snowballed, met some people and started training with them, and the rest kind of, yeah.
And when you say you started training with them, did you set a first goal? Was it a marathon? Was it?
Yeah. It's funny. A lot of people, they tiptoe into running. They start running. They run, a 5K, maybe a 10K. I kind of just I never even considered that like a shorter race was a thing I should do. I also was like, oh, I can run a 5K. I can run a 10K. Like that's not even. And I even thought
I can roll out of bed and do that.
Yeah, and I thought of a half marathon even. The running I was doing, I was kind of like, I could kind of do that. That's already it's just a little bit longer. Like we're okay. And so I just decided to jump straight into it. And marathoning was kind of like, was there.
Yeah. Did you do LA first?
I didn't actually. I was training, my first marathon, I was training for LA. This was like 2020, 2021. That was 2021. I was training for LA, and I had like my first running injury about like a month or two before the race. I had to pull out of the race, take like 8 weeks off, and kind of had to rebuild. And so I set my sights on a race in the summertime. So
what was that like for you mentally? Of you're getting toward you build up to this thing, and before you do the first one.
Yeah, I think it was interesting because I think I was like, it was my first lesson in something that I realized that I will learn many times, and I've already learned multiple times over with running, that it can be like an utterly heartbreaking sport, especially in the long distance space, in the sense that like it beats your body up so much, and there's some things that you might be fitter than your body is able to actually handle. So your engine wants to keep going, but your body doesn't know how to handle that yet.
So not telling yourself that you failed. Say you got there a little early.
Yeah, I got there a little early, and I maybe bit off more than I could chew right away, and getting hurt is just going to be part of it, and getting injured is not necessarily an end of something, but a beginning of something else. And knowing that like the quicker you can let go of like whatever expectation you had, and the quicker you can kind of start looking at it as like, okay, we're rebuilding for something new. Injuries can actually kind of be, it's like, I forget who it was. Somebody called it like the blessing of injury, and it really is that, I think.
Yeah.
I think something that's really interesting about running and surfing, especially in the way that you do them, is they kind of bring you to the two things that when people go through tough times, when people navigate anything hard, usually you turn to ritual first.
Yeah.
And I think the cool thing about running and surfing is both of them are rituals that involve either yourself, or you can do them with other people. They're completely interchangeable in that way. What have you navigated in life where you've said that this not saved me, but in a way where you say like locking in on this thing has changed my life experience for the better?
Yeah, I mean, I think my first experience with that kind of mindset was more with surfing than running. My mom passed away in 2016, and my mom and I had a really strong connection through surfing. She didn't surf, but she took me surfing my entire life. So surfing was the thing that I like dove into really, really kind of hard after her passing, and I think it like helped me maintain a connection in a way. I feel a lot of similarities with running, not necessarily, to the degree of losing a parent, but, going through breakups, going through, issues, career, work, friendship issues, whatever. I find that running, whether it's solo or with friends, it does kind of allow you to have a space that allows you to just kind of like check in with yourself,
Meditate.
both physically, emotionally, and mentally. And it's not always good. Like when you check in with yourself, oftentimes it's not good. Physically,
when you
it hurts.
Open that door, sometimes close it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sometimes you open the door, you don't like what's there, but you're already doing it, so you kind of just then have to exist in that discomfort. Yeah, yeah, and so I think the routine of just like having. I can make all the jokes in the world about like you go through something, you go run, you're running away from your problems, and I joke around with my friends about that all the time. They're like, "Oh, you run so many miles a week. Like, what are you running away from?" We're like, "Everything." Like, but in reality, it's like nothing puts you more face to face with whatever you're going through than being in a kind of compromised situation, both physically, mentally, and emotionally.
That was my experience with grief too. Is I actually had a really hard time meditating in the traditional sense of like meditation, like sitting down doing breath work, etc. I find that there's a really interesting category of things that are meditative but not meditation. And surfing and running both have that characteristic. I think, when you reach these long distances, when you're running, 26 miles at a clip, what is that internal dialogue like as you kind of shift from this very conscious thinking that we do every day of, I got to do this, then this, then this, into this, like, I have one goal for the next 26 miles.
Yeah, it's funny. You would think that that there's like one state of mind that you try to get to and to kind of zone out. But I was just talking about this right before we did this interview, that the last couple marathons I've raced have been really flat courses. And so you think like flat course, reach your race speed, and you're going to hold it until you hit the finish line and suffer and whatever. But in reality, the flatness and the lack of change and the lack of like different sensations, it's all one sensation physically.
It's an amazing metaphor for life.
Right. But those are actually maybe you're going through so many different mindsets and emotional states during that one flat, unchanging run. And I think like there's kind of like people commonly kind of say like the marathon doesn't start until like mile 20 or 21, because in training you get to mile 20 often, right? You get 20 miles in a day pretty consistently when you're training hard. After mile 20, it's like it's physiologically like a different feat.
You're not supposed to do that.
You're not supposed
to
do
that. People are not made
that.
to do that.
Yeah, not at the speed that we try to do them. And so I feel like there oftentimes is like a massive mental, emotional shift that you have to go through to sustain for the last 10K or 6 miles. The first marathon I did, I felt like $1 million until I crossed mile 21. And then I felt like the entire weight of the world crashed down on me for the last 6 miles. And that was only 6 miles. I'd already run 21, but those 6 miles felt 10 times longer than anything I'd run.
And what do you do mentally in that moment? Is it I know this is ending in a fixed number of miles, so I'm going to push through it? Or how do you kind of intersect with that?
It's funny. I think it's got to be different for everybody. But I think for me, knowing that it's over soon doesn't help, because it doesn't change what you're feeling right in that moment. And so there's a lot of like things that I kind of lean on that I picked up from different books and from my coach. My coach is like really big into mindfulness and meditation. And so there's lots of little things that he's kind of told us. But there's a book called by Mike Spino called Beyond Jogging, The Inner Spaces of Running. It's a really great book. And there's a thing he talks a lot about different visualization tricks to kind of take yourself out of what you're feeling and instead like feel like you're supported in a moment. So he talks about like quite literally envisioning like a big hand pushing you along, or talks about, imagining that you've like lassoed a bird in front of you and it's pulling you along and things like that. And so I lean on a lot of like different types of kind of like actual visualizations in the moment. And I think like it kind of takes you out of what you're feeling physically, but taps you in mentally a little bit more, because you actually have to intentionally go there and think about that and believe something. And so, yeah, I think those are like the kinds of things I like to lean on. Not try to get out of the feeling, but instead like go kind of further into the feeling.
Yeah.
And just find ways to make that maybe playful and interesting for you.
And I think there's a really interesting creative component there too.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to adjust in real time. I think a lot of the reason people struggle with questions like this is everyone wants like a fixed answer of when X happens, you do Y.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more like music. You might have a set list and get on stage and be playing to an audience and nobody's fucking with what you're playing.
Right.
And so you got to say, I'm sure you've been running and you've been at mile 20 and the visualization doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, actually, the first marathon I ran, like you think about, you follow a training plan or your coach gives you a plan and it's very, routinized and you know what's coming, when your big workouts are supposed to be, things like that. Our coach throws curveballs all the time. Sometimes he doesn't tell us what the workout is until we arrive at the track or wherever we're meeting up. And so I think like intentionally keeping us kind of malleable, I think is one thing, but on race day, you can have everything planned to a T and it just might not go your way, or something might happen physically, whatever. It just might not be your day. And being able to like understand that that's not, because it's not your day doesn't mean the thing is over. You're still there for, a certain amount of hours. So the first marathon I ran, I had a group of people I was training with. We had a race plan. We all were planning on going out together, like 4 or 5 of us. And we were like, okay, we're going to stick together till mile 18 or 19. And then after that, it's kind of like whoever's race, like we all do our thing. And about 5 minutes before the start of the race, we're all at the start line. Somebody decides, I think my plan's a little aggressive. I'm gonna start slower. Somebody's like, I'm gonna actually start faster than we planned. I'm gonna whatever. So I went into my first marathon thinking I'm running with my training partners for 20 miles before we all do our own thing. And in the 5 minutes before the buzzer goes off, it's like everyone's plans changed, and I know, okay, I'm actually running by myself the entirety of my first marathon, and I have no idea what to expect. And I think there's like a kind of a beautiful metaphor for like life and dealing with traumatic experiences and things like that, because you can easily panic and shut down and freak out and then change your plan to match what everyone else is doing and follow that path. But ultimately, if you do your own thing, like it's your own race, you're the only one that's going to run those miles. You're the only one that's trained the way you've trained. It's like has to be a personal experience entirely. Otherwise, it's not your race.
And you say, malleable is such an interesting word there, because I think people would think that a training plan makes you achieve a very specific thing. But the reality is that plan is that the training is to keep you malleable.
Right.
I think when we're teaching, with the Charlie Fund, we're trying to communicate something really similar to kids. These tools about being able to identify emotions and communicate emotions are not so that, hey, if you feel this, do this. Mm-hmm. It's just all context. Yeah. And it's just all data points that you put in your head and you say, I've done this thought exercise, which makes you a marginally better thinker. Yeah. You've done this workout, which made you a better runner. Right. Not so that you can go run this exact distance at this exact speed.
Yeah, getting familiar with sensation. Like, the feeling that you get at the end of a marathon, if you've never had it before, can be overwhelming and kind of crippling. But when you know that feeling's coming and you train to put yourself in that feeling as often as possible, when it does come, which it will come every race, you kind of know what to do. And it's not necessarily always going to work, but it's less scary. And I think that's like, it's interesting. You see a lot of people race a marathon, especially their first marathon, and myself included. Everyone I know that I run with has a pretty similar experience. They're terrified. They run their first marathon. They feel like shit after. They're like, I never want to do that again. And within like an hour or two, they're talking about which race they're going to run next. Yeah. And it's like you interview them right when the race is over. They're never running another marathon. You interview them an hour later. They probably have already signed up for their next race. Yeah. And I think like that's what's really interesting is like you willingly accept something that is going to be difficult, and then consistently put yourself in as close as difficult a position as possible to make sure you gain a familiarity with like the trauma of the experience.
Well, that's the whole thing about grief is it's that exact same experience, but unwilling.
Yeah.
It's that exact same experience, but you get handed it instead of signing up to do it.
Yeah.
In running, you sign up to do something where you say, I'm going to feel terrible.
Yeah.
But I'm going to look back and say this was amazing. That's running. That's the whole thing in a nutshell. Grief is the same way.
Yeah.
I'm sure with what you've experienced, you wouldn't look back and change it.
No, not at all.
But in the moment, you're like, there's nothing I would rather be feeling less right now than this thing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It's funny, you mentioned willing and unwilling. There's a book that that our team, we're called the Capri Collective. There's a book that we've all read by a sociology professor at Simon Fraser. Her name's Lindsay Freeman. She's amazing. She wrote a book called Running. It's part of Duke University Press's Practices series.
Cool.
And she has a passage, and I hate to read from my phone, but I want to read it.
No,
it's
please
about,
please pull it up.
About
would
kind
absolutely
of,
love that.
And she's quoting actually a few other passages here, but she talks about in poet and runner Thomas Gardner's memoir about everyday practice and running through grief, he writes, at some point in almost every race, you get lost. You open your eyes and realize you're in trouble. Your heart rate rises, your concentration buckles, and you're suddenly flailing around inside with no landmarks save for a familiar hatred of yourself and the ego that made you line up and race. You slow down and turn on yourself. And even in an otherwise blissed out account of running, Fred Rohe concedes in his 1974 handbook, The Zen of Running, sometimes running is suffering intentionally for the sake of seeing. Sometimes running is resisting and suffering unintentionally because we are human beings. Let's not make our running a fantasy and let our running be real. And I think like that last bit really kind of speaks to that a little bit.
Love it, and embracing that.
You sometimes choose to do it and you want to do it. And other times you want nothing but to feel good when you're running and you feel bad and you have to suffer unintentionally. You're either welcoming the suffering or you're not, but it's going to happen.
What does community and Capri Collective and all that mean to you in running? How has that impacted your kind of path as a runner?
Yeah, I think it's everything for me. Capri, we all met through various other running groups, and we kind of gravitated towards each other as friends. And I think it's funny. It's even when you're training on your own a lot, knowing that you're training in community with people, even if you're not physically together, there's a solidarity kind of component, things like that are really great. But I think most of the people that are in Capri Collective, we've only known each other for a few years at most. And I think they're some of my closest friends, and not just closest friends, but like they're people I've told things about my life and that have told me things about their life that they haven't told anybody that they've known their entire lives, right? And I think there's something really interesting about not only like the physical act of training together, which is like, it's helpful to suffer with other people through training. It makes it easier and more fun. But there's something really interesting about like the kind of like inherent state of vulnerability that training puts you in, and doing that with people that were maybe strangers 2-3 years ago. And now it's like we're there's some of like just my closest relationships. I think that's like, it's really powerful. And so I think, yeah, our community in running for us is so much more than just like training together. A lot of it is like building this collective of people that actually like now really care about each other in a way that's really supportive.
Outside the lines.
Yeah, entirely. Yeah.
So I think something there's a quote from Sarah Mangusa that I think is an interesting one to reflect on here. I knew I was getting somewhere when I began losing interest in the beginnings and ends of things.
Yeah.
And I think as a runner, like you said, you end one thing and instantly begin the other. Do you look at the training for each moment as I'm getting ready for this moment, or do you view it all in this way that bleeds together and just becomes a part of that collective?
Yeah, that's a great quote. It's funny. I think like there's a lot of run crews, run clubs that train for specific races, and it's like there's this training cycle, and then you race, and then you rest, and then there's this training cycle, and then you race, and then you rest, and it's like these big end moments and these starting moments, and end moments and starting moments. And I think while that's great, and I think like any form of running is positive, and I want people to do it. One thing that our coach, Knox Robinson, he's really, really interesting, amazing dude. He talks a lot about like developing a practice of running and not treating it as these like peaks and valleys and like these moments, but instead it's a consistent practice. And so, when we're training for a race, like he'll oftentimes remind us that we're not actually training for that race. We're training for 3 races from now or whatever. But it really does help to put things into perspective, and no longer is there an end and no longer is there starting. There's just running, and there's these moments where you turn it on a little bit more and see what you're made of a little bit and see what kind of work you've done and see where that brings you. But then it always just goes back to running. There's no start over.
It's an amazing metaphor for life, and it's exactly what we're doing here.
Yeah.
You never arrive with identifying your emotions. You just keep doing it every single day.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I'd love to. The thing I would love to wrap up with is kind of a conversation of what happens mentally when you can't run, when you're navigating that injury. You said, I go through things that'll take me out of running for a couple months at a time. For someone who's as routine driven as you are, and as anyone is, a couple months is a fucking eternity.
Yeah.
So to navigate those couple months outside of running, what does that look like, and how does that change your relationship with your own well-being?
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm quite literally going through that at the moment. I'm like 6 weeks in with no running right now, and it would be really easy for me to just replace running with something else for 6 weeks, getting on a bike or going to the gym or whatever. Like that's not a solve for feeling sad that I'm not running and for missing the practice. But I think that's really where like the community element of running really comes into play is it's running for me, and I think for a lot of my teammates is so much more than just like our running. It's the running of our entire collective. Everyone's got their individual running relationships.
So you can
running,
tap in, you can lean on the team. Instead of saying, I'm going to replace it for myself, I'm going to work with my team.
Yeah, and that might mean, you show up to the track when they're training and you support them and you get a little bit of joy out of that. We actually, we use one of my teammates, Giovanna Fisher, she's incredible. She's kind of introduced us to a lot of terminology from kind of the queer and kink world that relates a lot to running. It's specifically on this topic, but like the term compersion specifically, it's like getting pleasure out of the pleasure of your partner, and we've totally internalized that term of compersion as it applies to running. When I can't run, when I can't train, but I see my teammates having a great workout and doing the hard thing that I wish I was doing, like I feel like I participated if I'm there to support them in any way. And I think vice versa.
Dude, that was amazing.
Yeah.
What a great place to end.
Yeah, thank you.
Watch your mic. There you go.
It's terrifying.
Almost repeated the zoe.
Yeah.
Dude, that was awesome.
Thanks, bro.